wow, my Flight Simulator skills are not what they used to be. But anyway guys, the long and short of it is, yes, you can run Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 on macOS and have a great time with it, with a lot of the details and textures and graphics all turned up to maximum, and have a really acceptable frame rate as I've got here. But in order to do it, you need to use Paralles Pro. Hi, it's Adam here from adaminsights.com, and I have got Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 working well and running on macOS Catalina. It seems to be working really well. I've got all of the graphics turned up quite high, not to absolute top level, but very high, and I'm getting over 30 frames a second out of it, and I've been having a great time with it so far. Alright, so if you're anything like me, you probably grew up with Flight Simulator back in the late 90s and the early 2000s on Windows, and you had a great time with it. I definitely did, right up until Microsoft Flight Simulator X, and I was sad when it was discontinued. But then I started working, and I had to move to Macintosh platform for the type of work that I did, and so I couldn't keep running Flight Simulator anyway. But now I decided I wanted to run Flight Simulator on my Mac, and I've figured out a great way to do it. It's actually really easy, so let's dive right in and have a look. Okay, so no, I am not dual booting with Bootcamp on my Mac in order to run Windows and play Microsoft games. What I'm actually using is Paralles, but I'm not using the standard Paralles. I'm using Paralles Pro, and I'll explain why in a second. Normally playing the latest games with Windows through Paralles isn't possible, because Paralles by default can't access more than 8 gig of RAM, and it can't access the graphics card. It has to emulate a graphics card, and it uses some of the RAM that it accesses for that. And also it tends to it's not very good at using the resources in your Mac. That's what I've found anyway. But what I ended up doing was installing Paralles Pro. So I've got a reasonably high-end MacBook Pro 16-inch here. I do a lot of graphics and video, 3D stuff for work. So this machine is an i9. It's running 32 gig RAM, and it has a 4 gig AMD 5500 graphics card. It's not the best specs out there, but it is reasonably high-end. Alright, so I've installed Paralles Pro, and the advantage of Paralles Pro is you can access a lot more than 8 gig of RAM into Paralles, and it seems that Paralles can now use the AMD 5500 graphics card, which is obviously what we need to get the most out of Flight Simulator. It's a bit weird. If you just run Paralles with the computer by itself, even plugged into a power cord, macOS always just wants to default to the lower end integrated graphics. There are some apps that will force Mac OS to flick over to the 5500, so whenever I load up any of the Adobe apps, immediately Mac OS flicks over to the 5500. Or you can manually tell the Mac to always use the native graphics card, but that will affect your power consumption on the Mac and can make it run quite hot if you do that, even just when you want to leave it sitting on the desktop. Or you can plug in an external monitor, and then Mac will immediately flick over to the higher end AMD 5500 graphics card in your MacBook Pro. If you're on an iMac or something like that, I guess figure that out. You might, or just install Paralles Pro and see how you go. Anyway, let's just boot up into Windows 10. Installing Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is a royal pain. It took about 3 days of downloading to eventually get it there. But it's what it is, I guess. It was worth the wait. One of the things I have found with Flight Simulator to make it run properly in Parallels is you do have to right click on the icon and select Run as Administrator on Windows. Initially, Microsoft will have a quick look at the specs that it seems are available to Flight Simulator through Parallels, and it'll give you an error message saying that your computer doesn't meet the minimum requirements for Flight Simulator. What I've done is just click OK and proceeded anyway. You do wait a few seconds on the desktop for it to load up, because what it seems is going on is initially Parallels and Windows are just using a smaller amount of resources that have been allocated to Windows. But then as soon as you end up in the game, a lot more resources appear to get allocated to Parallels and Windows. And we'll prove that in a minute, because right now it should be running the pre-game cinematics, but it can't even run them with the resources that are available to it. Now, in order to get Parallels to be able to use your higher end graphics card in the Mac to get the most out of the game, you have to, in the graphics option in Flight Simulator, say that you want to use full screen. I also select a couple of screen resolutions below what I know the native resolution of the screen is. So this is a 1920 by 1080 screen that I'm running at full screen on. I've selected this to run at about 1680 by 1050, and it still looks fine. And the good thing about doing that is I can I can have like my buildings and my textures and everything else up to maximum, and I can still get more than 30 frames a second out of the game and have a great time. These loading screens will seem to take quite a while. I am aware that they are much faster natively on Windows than if you do use Bootcamp, but these are just loading screens. I'm happy to wait an extra couple of minutes here if I don't actually have to go ahead and use Bootcamp. So, I've just booted into the menu for Flight Simulator 2020. Yes, it takes a few minutes because it seems that Parallels just doesn't give Windows much resources until you end up flying. But as soon as you end up flying, you can have a great time. So let's have a look and see how Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 performs on macOS Catalina. So I actually haven't had much time to play around with how the game works yet. I've just really configured my graphics settings and got it running and had a couple of little fun flights. So I'm just going to select world map, and I'll select a plane. What do I want? There's something that's going to be quite easy to fly so I don't make myself look silly in a video. Something with the wings up top, because yeah, let's have this. I'm choosing this because it's got the wings up top, and that's actually quite fun for them using the hat switch on your joystick to have a look at the landscape. Funnily enough, configuring the joystick has been the most difficult part of the entire experience. Trying to actually get Windows to recognize the USB device, which is plugged into a hub connected to macOS and then into Windows and then into Flight Simulator, was a bit of a pain. You had to unplug it and plug it in a few times, and it seems initially everything on the joystick was reversed, but that's straightforward enough. You just reverse it within the game and you're fine. So I've selected my aircraft, and I'm going to select Adelaide International Airport. Adelaide is the best city in the world, and so, well, it might not look like the best city in the world on Flight Simulator, but in real life it is the best city in the world. I'm biased because I live there. Anyway, I'm going to select to travel out of Adelaide. Okay, so I've got my joystick all configured. It's funny really, I'm sort of remembering what some of the initial controls were like back on Flight Simulator 98, 2000, 2004 and FSX and all that. They're not the same. I wish they were. Anyway, let's just throttle up and go for a flight. And here we go. So we've got a very acceptable frame rate on Flight Simulator. Sure enough, I'm running this in Adelaide, which is one of the AI generated cities. It doesn't have as much going for it as a lot of the other cities in Flight Simulator. I think, reading some of the early forums, I think Australia probably got the rough end of the stick as far as the city details go. Like, this is with all of the buildings and all the details turned up to just about maximum, and Adelaide looks a little bit sparse. I will say Adelaide looks a little bit sparse in this, but then I'm flying quite low to the ground, so and of course we've got American accents at an Australian airport. That doesn't really sound very realistic. So where's Adelaide? Where's the CBD? There's the CBD. Okay. Right, I'll say here, obviously it's picked up on the hospital, it's picked up on the Adelaide Oval, it's picked up on North Adelaide. So I guess right now I'm flying somewhere over Woodville. Anyway guys, the long and short of it is, yes, you can run Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 on macOS and have a great time with it, with a lot of the details and textures and graphics all turned up to maximum, and have a really acceptable frame rate as I've got here. But in order to do it, you need to use Paralles Pro, and you just need to put up with some very slow loading screens initially.